In the shadowed corridors of Tel Aviv, where secrets are currency and silence is survival, there exists a program so classified that even veteran Mossad operatives speak of it only in whispers. It's called Zairim, the young ones, and it represents one of the most controversial chapters in intelligence history. The year was 1963. Israel faced existential threats from all borders. Traditional interrogation methods were failing. The enemy had learned to resist torture, to withstand pressure, to maintain cover stories under extreme duress. What the Mossad needed wasn't just better interrogators. They needed interrogators who could think like the enemy, who carried no biases, who could read micro-expressions before they learned to fake them. The solution was as brilliant as it was morally devastating. Recruit them young. So young they'd never question the mission. So young they'd become the perfect weapon before they understood what a weapon was. This is the story of how Israel's intelligence service transformed orphans and displaced children into the most effective interrogation unit the world has never known about. Keep reading to discover the psychological techniques that made children more effective than trained adults, and the moral cost that haunts Mossad to this day. Chapter 1. The Selection. The buses arrived at dawn, unmarked and unremarkable, rolling through the dusty streets of immigrant absorption centers across Israel. Inside these centers lived the Yaldei HaGeula, children of redemption, Jewish refugees from Yemen, Iraq, Morocco, and Ethiopia. Orphaned by persecution, displaced by history, they were invisible to society, perfect for a program that didn't officially exist. Reuven Shiloh, architect of the program, had studied Soviet methods in the gulags, Nazi psychological warfare, and British colonial interrogation techniques. His conclusion was revolutionary. The human mind is most malleable between ages 7 and 12. Before puberty clouds judgment with hormones, before adolescent rebellion creates resistance to authority, there exists a window where a child can be shaped into something extraordinary. The selection process was disguised as educational opportunity. Social workers identified children who exhibited specific traits: exceptional memory, emotional detachment from trauma, linguistic aptitude, and what psychologists called adaptive dissociation, the ability to separate themselves from their emotions while maintaining acute awareness of others' feelings. These weren't the traumatized children who withdrew into silence. These were the ones who watched, who calculated, who survived by reading the room. Maya was 9 when they chose her. Ethiopian, orphaned during the Exodus, she had walked 300 miles to Sudan with her grandmother, watched her die in a refugee camp, and made it to Israel alone. In the absorption center, counselors noticed she never cried. Instead, she studied the other children, learned their patterns, traded her food rations for information about who was getting adopted, who was being sent where. She had turned survival into a system. The recruiter who interviewed her posed as a teacher from a special school for gifted children. He asked her riddles, showed her photographs of people, and asked what they were feeling, presented her with moral dilemmas that had no right answers. Maya answered each question with clinical precision, showing neither excitement nor fear at the opportunity. That emotional flatness sealed her selection. Across Israel, 43 children were chosen that year. They ranged from 7 to 13. Most were orphans. Some had parents who signed custody over to the state, believing their children were entering elite educational programs. In a way, they were. The curriculum would just be different than anyone imagined. The children were transported to a facility in the Negev Desert, a former British military installation that existed on no official maps. The surrounding landscape was perfect for psychological purposes. Endless, empty, offering no reference points for escape or rebellion. Here, the world would become whatever the trainers said it was. On their first night, the children were separated into individual rooms. No belongings, no personal items. Each room was identical. A bed, a desk, a mirror, a clock. The message was immediate and absolute. Your old life is gone. Your identity is irrelevant. Time itself belongs to us now. Some children cried that first night. Maya didn't. She studied her room, counted the tiles on the floor, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next would redefine the boundaries of psychological warfare. Chapter 2. The Breaking. The first month was called Hashlama, completion, though the instructor's true intention was destruction. Before you could build a perfect interrogator, you had to dismantle the child completely. Sleep deprivation began immediately. Random schedules, lights at irregular intervals, meals served at unpredictable times. The circadian rhythm, that ancient clock governing human behavior, was deliberately shattered. Within 2 weeks, the children lost all sense of day or night. Time became an abstraction controlled entirely by their handlers. Language was the second weapon. The children came from different countries, speaking Hebrew, Arabic, Amharic, French. The instructors forbade native languages. Communication occurred only in a constructed pidgin of codes and gestures. The goal wasn't multilingual education, it was linguistic disorientation. When you strip language, you strip the ability to form coherent thoughts of resistance. The children stopped thinking in words and started thinking in patterns. Maya excelled. While other children struggled with the arbitrary rules that changed daily, she recognized the underlying algorithm. Nothing here was random. Everything was a test. When instructors screamed at her for folding her blanket wrong, she understood they were measuring her response to irrational authority. When they praised her for actions that had earned punishment the day before, she recognized they were training her to abandon moral consistency for situational adaptation. The psychological techniques grew more sophisticated. Children were paired randomly and told to report on each other's disloyal thoughts. There were no disloyal thoughts being monitored. The exercise was about normalizing betrayal, about severing the human instinct for solidarity. Friendship became dangerous. Trust became vulnerability. The children learned to perform intimacy while maintaining absolute emotional isolation. Paradoxical conditioning was introduced in month 2. A child would be severely punished, then immediately embraced and comforted by the same instructor. Pain and love, administered by the same hand, created cognitive dissonance that shattered normal psychological defense mechanisms. The children's brains, desperate for pattern recognition, began to accept contradiction as natural. This would later prove invaluable in interrogation, where creating cognitive dissonance in subjects was essential to breaking resistance. 3 children didn't survive the program, not physically. There were no deaths, nothing that would leave evidence, but psychologically, they fragmented beyond recovery. Catatonia, selective mutism, complete disassociation. They were quietly transferred to psychiatric facilities under false identities, labeled as casualties of immigration trauma. The program continued. The mirror exercise began in week 7. Each child sat alone in their room, facing a mirror for 6 hours daily. The instruction was simple. See yourself as we see you. No elaboration, no guidance. The children stared at their reflections until their faces became alien, until the self became an object to be studied rather than experienced. Dissociation, that psychological distance between observer and observed, was the goal. An interrogator must see through subjects without being seen, must witness suffering without feeling empathy. Maya sat before her mirror and practiced expressions: smile, frown, anger, fear. She performed each emotion with technical precision, watching how her face muscles moved, how her eyes changed. Then she practiced the absence of expression, the blank mask that revealed nothing. She was 9 years old and learning to hide her humanity behind her own face. By month 3, the children no longer asked when they could go home. The concept of home had been successfully eradicated. Dakatum. Chapter 3. The Building. Phase 2 of Tzerim was called Binyan Hanefesh, soul construction, though what they were building bore little resemblance to traditional concepts of soul. These children would become living polygraphs, human surveillance systems, psychological scalpels designed to extract truth from the most resistant subjects. The training shifted from destruction to specialization. Each child's natural aptitudes were identified and weaponized. Those with perfect recall became human recording devices, capable of reproducing interrogation sessions verbatim months later. Children with linguistic gifts were trained in Arabic dialects, learning not just words, but the subtle variations that revealed a subject's village of origin, their education level, their tribal affiliations. Others showed talent for reading micro-expressions, the involuntary facial movements lasting fractions of a second that betrayed deception. Maya's gift was emotional mirroring. She could observe a subject for minutes and then replicate their emotional state so precisely that it created instant rapport. The instructors recognized this as rare talent. Most interrogators spent years learning to build trust. Maya could manufacture it in moments. They refined her ability through thousands of hours of practice with actors, prisoners, volunteers, and eventually real intelligence targets. The curriculum was comprehensive and disturbing. Children studied anatomy, not for medical purposes, but to understand stress responses. They learned where to apply pressure without leaving marks, how to create psychological pain that exceeded physical torture, how to use environmental factors like temperature and sound to accelerate psychological breakdown. They were taught pharmacology, which drugs lowered inhibitions, which created paranoia, which made time perception expand or contract. But the most powerful weapon wasn't pharmaceutical or physical. It was psychological manipulation through narrative construction. The children learned to become whatever the subject needed them to be. For a captured Palestinian fighter missing his family, 12-year-old Maya could become a surrogate daughter, evoking paternal instincts that override operational security. For a hardened terrorist expecting violence, she could be curious innocence, asking questions that seemed like a child's naive interest, but were carefully designed to reveal organizational structure. The ethics modules were perhaps the most insidious aspect of the program. Rather than ignoring moral questions, the instructors addressed them directly, reframing interrogation as a form of salvation. Every terrorist you break is hundreds of innocent lives saved, they repeated until it became doctrine. Your sacrifice is protecting the nation. Your burden is heroic. The children were taught to see themselves as tragic heroes, bearing moral weight so others wouldn't have to. Live training began at age 11. The children were brought into actual Mossad interrogation sessions, initially as observers, then as participants. They sat in rooms where captured operatives were questioned, watching master interrogators work, learning the rhythm of psychological warfare. The subjects, informed they were being watched by trainee analysts, never suspected the blank-faced children taking notes were themselves weapons in training. Maya's first real interrogation was a Syrian intelligence officer captured during a border operation. He'd been processed through standard techniques for 3 days and revealed nothing beyond basic biographical data. They brought Maya in, dressed her in regular clothes, positioned her with coloring books at a table in the corner of the interrogation room. The officer's eyes flickered toward her, confusion, then concern. Who brings a child into an interrogation? Maya looked up from her coloring and spoke in perfect Damascus-accented Arabic. My uncle had a beard like yours. He died in Aleppo. Not a question, just a statement, delivered with a child's matter-of-fact tone. The officer's face showed micro-expressions of shock. How did this child know his hometown dialect? Followed by involuntary grief. Maya watched these reactions with clinical precision, then continued coloring, letting the silence work. 3 hours later, using nothing but carefully deployed observations about his family, his neighborhood, his childhood memories, Maya had mapped his entire intelligence network. He never realized he was being interrogated by a child. He thought he was simply talking to comfort a lonely girl who reminded him of his niece. The program had succeeded in creating something unprecedented. Interrogators who could bypass every defense because they triggered paternal and protective instincts instead of resistance and hostility. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. By 1973, the TSIRIM program had produced 27 active operators. They ranged from 16 to 22 years old, but their psychological age was incalculable. They'd spent their formative years in a world where manipulation was language, where empathy was a tool rather than a feeling, where identity itself was performance art. The program's success was undeniable. Intelligence extracted by TSIRIM operatives had prevented 17 major terrorist attacks, dismantled 4 Iranian intelligence cells in Europe, and provided critical information during the Munich Olympics crisis. The children turned interrogators achieved breakthrough rates 40% higher than conventional operatives. They were perfect weapons, but weapons, even perfect ones, have consequences. In 1974, an operator codenamed Tamar, recruited at age 8, now 19, experienced a complete psychological break during a routine interrogation in Cyprus. She'd been questioning a Hezbollah logistics coordinator using her standard technique, emotional mirroring combined with constructed intimacy. Mid-session, she stopped, looked at the subject and whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." She walked out of the safe house and disappeared for 3 weeks, found eventually in a psychiatric hospital in Athens, unable to recall her real name or any memories before the program. The incident forced Mossad leadership to confront what they'd created. These operatives had no genuine identity beneath their trained personas. They'd been shaped so young, manipulated so completely, that when you stripped away the programming, there was nothing underneath. They were functional psychopaths by design, not born without empathy, but trained to suppress it so thoroughly they could no longer access authentic emotional experience. Maya, by then 21, was among the highest functioning graduates. She'd completed 63 successful interrogations, extracted intelligence that saved countless lives, and showed no signs of psychological deterioration. But in private sessions with program psychiatrists, a different picture emerged. She described her life as watching myself perform being human. She maintained relationships, smiled at appropriate moments, expressed emotions that she understood intellectually but didn't feel internally. She'd become so skilled at mirroring others that she had no emotional baseline of her own. The ethical reckoning began internally. Dr. Sarah Leibowitz, one of the program's founding psychologists, authored a classified memo arguing for immediate shutdown. We've created operatives with extraordinary capabilities, but stolen their capacity for human connection. They function, but they don't live. We've committed psychological murder in the name of national security. The memo was buried, but doubts spread. Instructors who'd spent years shaping these children into weapons began experiencing their own moral injuries. One committed suicide, leaving a note, "I destroyed their souls to save the nation. I don't know if that trade was righteous." Politically, the program became impossible to maintain. By the late 1970s, human rights discourse had shifted. What seemed like justified sacrifice during existential national crisis appeared, in retrospect, like systematic child abuse. The children hadn't volunteered. They'd been selected when incapable of informed consent. Even if the program saved lives, the cost in human dignity was becoming indefensible. In 1979, Xyrem was officially discontinued. The remaining operatives were offered two options: continue working in intelligence with different methodologies, or accept discharge with comprehensive mental health support and new identities. Most chose to continue. Interrogation was the only life they'd known, the only context where their constructed personas made sense. Maya chose discharge. She moved to Canada under a new identity, worked as a translator, married, had children. By external measures, she achieved normal life. But in interviews conducted decades later for this account, she described existence as permanent alienation. "I can perform being a mother, a wife, a friend. I understand the mechanics, but I'm always watching myself from outside, calculating the correct emotional response. I was 12 when they finished building me, and whoever I might have been was gone by then." The legacy of Xyrem remains classified, but its impact on modern intelligence methodology is undeniable. Ethical guidelines now prohibit recruitment of minors into covert operations across Western intelligence services. Direct responses to programs like this. The psychological techniques developed, however, continue in modified forms, applied to adult recruits with proper consent and mental health oversight. In 2019, a former Mossad director acknowledged the program's existence in an encrypted academic paper, writing, "We created perfect interrogators by sacrificing the humanity of children who had no choice. Every piece of intelligence they extracted, every attack they prevented, came at the cost of their stolen childhoods and fractured psyches. History may judge whether that bargain was necessary. I'm no longer certain it was justifiable." Maya, now 68, lives quietly in Toronto. She maintains no contact with other program survivors. When asked if she regrets her life, she considers the question with the same analytical precision that made her an exceptional operative. "Regret requires a sense of what could have been. They took that from me when I was 9. I saved lives. I prevented suffering. I performed those actions successfully, but I can't regret what was done to me because I'm not sure there's enough of me left to experience genuine regret. The children of Tserim protected a nation. The question that haunts Mossad's classified archives is whether the nation should have accepted their sacrifice. Bim.